Tomorrow I can leave after 14 days by myself.
Great.
You've been in quarantining for the virus.
Yeah, I'm in Israel. And when I landed, I had to go into 14 days quarantine.
Oh, as a standard thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's worth it.
Tomorrow I'll see if there are any other Israelis.
Have you been staying in the refit?
I wouldn't have minded. Wouldn't have minded.
The quarantine worse.
Quarantine's fine. I'm alive.
Hello there, boy.
Bari v'tari.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Baruch Hashem.
Hello.
Hi all.
Hi.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock. I'm going to share the screen. It's I think it's a little bit longer than the average chapter. I'm going to try to get through it in the half an hour, or as close as possible to that. So obviously you are familiar that we're going through now the specific definitions of the 39 malachot. In chapter 8 and 9, the Rambam dealt with 10 malachot in each one after first listing all of them. And today we're going to deal with a further 8 malachot. Again, the malachas are the primary prohibitive creative activities from the Torah. Most of them, as we've seen, I mean, all of them, as we've seen, have toldot, which are derivatives of those. There's culpability when it's done for its intended purpose in the way that it was done. And then there are certain times where there's no culpability, but it's nonetheless prohibited. That would be prohibited rabbinically. And as we'll see in examples in each of the malachot that we're going to be focusing on today as well, that you will have these different categories. I'll share the screen and we'll be able to go through the text together. As much as possible, I'll try to read the original Hebrew and English, and we might have to kind of skip some of the Hebrew just as far as timing today, I would imagine. Okay, so the first malacha that he deals with today is the malacha of, hold on, I'm going to just, okay, everyone has muted. The malacha of kosher. Kosher means tying a knot. And as we'll see, the Rambam's definition, there are 2 requirements here. Kesher shel kayama, somebody has to tie a knot which is intended to remain permanent. V'hu ma'aseh uman. Secondly, it must be the type of knot that only a craftsman knows how to tie. In that instance, you have transgressed the biblical prohibition, chayav, you would be liable for the punishment that's Torah mitzvah. And he gives example, what is considered a craftsman's knot that generally is intended to remain permanent, and not that hagmalim, those who drive camels, the type of knot that they would tie their camels with, the kesher asaponim, or the knot that the seamen tie, that means, I guess, tying their, the sail to the boat, the kesher tzuais, or similarly knots that are tied min al the sandal, like the shoemaker ties the straps of the sandal onto the base of the shoe. We're not talking here about tying your laces. We're talking about there was a way in which they would permanently tie the strap onto the sole of the shoe. So those are types of knots that were required a particular craftsmanship and were generally tied for permanence. And those types, if there are any similar type of knot, one would be fully liable for transgressing a biblical prohibition on Shabbos. But if one of the details were missing, so you tied a knot with intention that it should remain permanently, but it was not particularly a skillful knot, you would be patur. You would not be liable. Of course, patur, it's not allowed. Rabbinically, it would be prohibited, but you would not be liable biblically. The kesher sheina, or conversely, you tied a knot that is not permanent, however, it is the act of a craftsman, then there too, but if it's not a permanent knot, nor is it a knot of a craftsman, that you can tie, as he translates here, with no compunction, no problem. Okay, so what are some of the examples of a knot that is in between? It's got one but not the other. Okay, that's what he's going to define now. He says, this is the kosher. If the strap on the shoe or the sandal tore and he ties it, or nifsak achewa kosher, or rope ties and you tie it back together. What are all these examples? These are examples of something that you're going to be reapplying a knot with the intention that it should remain permanent, but because you're not the shoemaker, you're not going to be doing the type of knot that is a craftsman's knot. So you got the one condition, but not the other. So you would be patur, but this is not something you should be doing. Similar things. So any type of knot that is just a simpleton's knot, even though that your intention is that it should remain. And similarly, a professional knot that is not intended for permanence also is usher. Also, one should not be doing that. Third halacha. So basically, in this halacha, what the Rambam is going to give examples of where you tie a knot that possibly it might remain permanent, but it's not really essentially a permanent knot. And he says in those instances, it's not a problem to make that knot. So what's an example? The way I understand this is some type of dress that would be tied on both shoulders. So essentially she could tie two knots on the shoulders, and she could untie the one in order to take it out and put it off, which means one of them may stay permanently. Nonetheless, he's not worried about this. It can be done. Similarly, if she ties a hairnet to her hair, so even though she would technically be able to take it off or put it on without actually retying it or untying it, nonetheless, it's not considered a permanent knot. It's not considered a professional knot, and one would be allowed to do this. Other similar examples would be, or tying your shoelace, right? Earlier we spoke about attaching the strap to the sole of the shoe. Here we're talking about tying the shoelace. Even though technically you could take your shoe off and put it back on without untying it or having to retie it, so it may stay there permanently because the type of knot that you're tying is not permanent, essentially, and it's not a professional knot essentially. So that's okay. Just as an aside, practically speaking, in practice, when we tie our shoes on Shabbos, generally we try not to do a double knot because the double knot gives it a permanence, and the double knot again has one of the conditions. It may not be a professional knot, but it's a permanent knot, and although you would be patur, although you wouldn't be liable rabbinically, it's not allowed. So tying shoelaces on Shabbos, one should do it with just a single knot, ideally. Okay. Similarly, he says one may tie pouches of wine and pouches of oil, although they have two protrusions. Again, because you would be able to take it off or remove it without undoing it, and therefore it may stay permanently, but it's not essentially a permanent type knot, and you would be able to do that. Similarly, you can tie a knot, a cord of linen to a bucket as opposed to a regular rope or your belt, because those generally will be taken off. And similarly, you can tie a knot. He says across. Basically, yeah, he's talking about if you got an animal within an area and you want to tie a string across, the animal can't come out. You're going to be tying it on each edge of the rope. Now, technically speaking, you can untie one in order to allow the animal out, and you may end up leaving the one permanent. He says, nonetheless, it's not essentially, again, another example, something not essentially a permanent knot or a professional knot, and can be done. He says, if you tie there is a similar type of sample, but an exception. This is where if you tied a rope to a cow, to the foot of the cow, and you tied it then to the feeding trough where it's going to eat from. So he says, if it initially had been tied to the one side, to the feeding trough, then he can tie the cow onto it. But you're not allowed to do both knots on Shabbos, because that's the type of knot that generally would stay there. However, he says if you did it with a weaver's rope as opposed to a normal type of rope, then you could do it, because the idea then is that even though you're tying both sides, one to the cow and one to the feeding trough, you're not going to be leaving your weaver's rope outside. You're going to be taking it off. So there's no sense of permanence there. There's also no sense of a professional knot, and it would not be a problem. And he clarifies this, right? Menesha kol ela akshurim ma'aseh hedya, then being that all these knots that we're talking about here are non-professional, the einun shel kayom, and they're not fundamentally knots that remain there permanently. Elapam kosher or pam matir. Sometimes you'll leave it there, sometimes you'll undo it. Therefore, mutar likshar oisin achilo, one is allowed to make these type of knots on Shabbos. He says that if you had these baskets of dates or dried figs tied up, you would be able to break off that cord and you could take them out. Now he says, what type of material can one use in order to make one of these temporary knots? He says, anything something that would be theoretically good to be used for animal fodder, you can use to tie on Shabbos. In other words, not something that's off bounds to in generally muktzah to touch or deal with on Shabbos. So, for example, a person's straps of his sandals snapped on Shabbos and he's in a karmelit. Karmelit basically means an area that's neither a public thoroughfare nor a private area. And the point is over here is that because it's a semi-public area and you're not going to leave your shoe there, and you're also not allowed to carry it because of a rabbinical prohibition. We'll learn later that the biblical prohibition of carrying is from a public domain to a private domain. So you can't carry it on the one hand. You also don't want to leave it there. So what can you do? So if you have some type of a reed that's moist, in other words, you would theoretically be able to feed it to an animal. What you can do is then you can tie that around your sandal to keep it on your foot, and then you can keep on walking with it. Or other similar type of situations. It's not that your strap broke, but it started slipping off. You would be able to use this in order to keep your shoe in place and continue to walk on with it. Ha'aniva. What's a aniva? Aniva is a loop. If you make basically a non-permanent knot, you're not actually knotting two ends together. You're looping something that's not a permanent knot to begin with. You're allowed to do that because it won't be interchanged with a knot. There's no chance basically that it's permanent. So therefore, if you had a rope that broke, you can put the two edges together and loop something around it. That would be fine on Shabbos. Halacha 6. Mutter liksher kesher she'ena shel kayomer. One is allowed to tie a knot, a non-permanent knot, the dvar mitzvah. So this is another example that means even if it was a professional type of knot. What is an example? He gives an example. You may come to a situation where you need to measure something if it is liable for something, if it has a minimum measurement. So you would be able to tie something in order to make that measurement. Another example would be nimas kinosh nifsap koshin oisei b'mikdash avalov medina in the Beis Hamikdash. Let's say they had musical instruments there that were played during the different services. If the harp string broke and it snapped, one would be allowed to tie it because it's being used in the performance of the service in the temple. If something like that happened outside of the Beis Hamikdash, there is no allowance for it. In fact, the reason why we don't play musical instruments in Shabbos is primarily because of this, because of scenarios where something might break or need retuning or need refixing, and that's why we don't play musical instruments on Shabbos. Now he says you're not allowed to tie a harp string for the first time on Shabbos, even in the temple. What he's saying over here is that the allowance is if you had one harp, you needed to use it. It's on Shabbos, you're in the midst of the service, it's part of the service, and you have no options. But if it's something that was from before Shabbos and you didn't take care of it before Shabbos, there's no excuse now to try and deal with it on Shabbos. Halacha 7. So this is actually the next malacha, which is untying. And the framing is like this. Any type of knot that you're not allowed to make, if that same type of knot you untie, you are transgressing the prohibition of untying. But if it's a type of knot that if you made it, you would not be liable, similarly, if you undid it, you wouldn't be liable. And then the third category is any type of knot that you're allowed to make, where there's no issur at all, there's no prohibition at all. Certainly you would be allowed to untie it. An example again would be tying a bow in your shoelaces where it's not a permanent knot and it's not a professional knot, and you would be able to tie a single bow, and you would be able to untie a single bow, no problem. This is halacha 8. If someone winds together ropes from different types of branches. Now, we learn about weaving, right? Weaving is one prohibition. And this over here is something else. The Rambam is talking about where you wind together different materials in order to lengthen them. So you kind of attaching one edge to another edge rather than winding them together to make a thicker cord, okay? The intention of it is to lengthen them. So you're attaching them. He says, that this type of activity is a tool, there's a derivative of tying a knot. Now, how tight does it have to be in order for it to be considered a derivative of a knot? He says, so long as that when you finished winding it together, right, now you've got a lengthened thing and it's held together, it doesn't just come apart easily. And he says, similarly, if somebody unwinds something that has been attached like that, this would be a derivative of untying, and the minimum would be the same, that if it was attached in a way that it was held together and now you are undoing it, that would be a transgression of the derivative of tying. Now we go into the next malacha, which is the malacha of sewing. And he explains that sewing requires 2 stitches, right? Up and over and up and over. And he says 2 stitches you're only liable for so long as you actually have a knot on either edge of them, on either end of them, because then it holds, because 2 stitches without the knots are not going to hold. As to why making those knots is not, at least it would seem the Rambam, a problem of tying knots, we could say because it's not a permanent knot or it's not a professional knot. But the point is that if you've only sewed 2 stitches without the knots, that's not a complete melacha. It's obviously not allowed, but it's not the complete melacha. However, once you start to sew more than 2 stitches, then already it's considered sewing, because it will hold on its own even without the tied knots on the edge of the thread. And anybody who tightens a thread, so if you've got a little thread that holds whatever to a garment together and it's getting and tighten it, so he says that someone is also liable for this on Shabbos because it's part of the process of sewing. Hakareh, tearing. Okay, tearing is breaking apart a garment, and here the intention should be for a positive outcome, right? We've learned before that an act that is essentially destructive, although again not allowed, but is not a direct transgression of the biblical prohibition. So if somebody is tearing in such a way that it's a positive outcome, and you've torn enough that you'll need to retie it or restitch it with 2 stitches, that is, a person is liable for the biblical prohibition. If your sole intention is just to destroy, pater, you're not allowed to do it, but it's not, you're not liable. Again, because this is all in a destructive nature. Something that he touched on I think it was the previous chapter as well. And here you see a fascinating idea where your intention or your mood, if it lightens your mood, even though it's a destructive act, it's considered something constructive and you would be liable. So he says, if somebody ripped something in anger, or he tore a garment because in grief for someone who's passed away, in those instances, you would be liable. Why? Because you gain from it. Your mind is settled. You become relaxed as a result. You've let out your rage. And therefore, even though it's a destructive act, but it's been a positive effect on you, that is considered a constructive act, and you would be liable. Anybody makes an opening of the neck on Shabbos is chayav. Even if basically they would create a garment from what it seems like, and they would have a gentle stitch on where the neck would go through. As soon as you break that, because that now actually makes it into something useful, into a garment that you can put over your head, that would always be chayav. You would always be liable for that. Okay, here we see a derivative of sewing. Hamadabek niyaris al uris b'kolon shel svarim. If you take glue and you stick 2 things together, or similar things, this is a derivative of sewing. And he says, similarly, if somebody separates something that has been stuck together, like whether hides or paper or whatever it might be, this is a derivative of tearing, and it would be a problematic unless his sole intention is that it should be destructive. This halacha and the next ones, boina and building and so on, are relevant in our Shabbos, in our day-to-day living, although the Rambam's rulings over here are not absolutely definitive, and there's quite a bit of discussion in the halachic decisive of the day, but just some areas where some of these things become a concern. Although in most cases there's ways to do it, but opening a can, opening a bottle, opening a box of cereal or something like that, most of these things there are halachic authorities that allow for them. If they're done, one of the most important things that you've got to be aware of is that you're not breaking letters, because that would be another malacha that we haven't studied yet, but we'll get to it. But they generally can be done, but many people will avoid them because there are those who consider them close to this, like tearing or creating a vessel in the process of doing these things. So many people are wary of doing this on Shabbos and would prepare before Shabbos. If you knew you needed any cans of tuna or whatever it might be, make sure it's open before Shabbos. Some people even make sure to open up their soda cans or their bottles of drink and so on, open up any coffee jars or cereal boxes and so on and so forth. Again, there are ways to do it, but it does touch on many of these malachot and is therefore a concern. Each person, should try and figure that out on their own exactly how to apply this in their life. But what I'm saying is that these malachot that we're learning here, with examples that sometimes seem abstract, they become very relevant when we think about some of the common items that we use and how we might apply. Okay, onto the 12th halacha. Because now we get onto the next malacha that the Rambam deals with, which is building. And he says building, even the smallest amount, is already liable for the prohibition. And he gives examples of what might be an act of building. So a person who levels the floor inside his house, or if he lowers something, that a piece of earth that was raised, or if he fills a cavity, all this is considered part of the prohibition of building on Shabbos. He's giving an example. If you're laying stones to create a wall or to build something, so he says if you place a stone down and then and one person puts the stone, another person puts the mortar there or the cement. So the person who puts the cement there, that's the one that's liable, because generally speaking, if you put stones one on top of the other, it's just going to crumble. So there's no problem laying the first stone. The person that then puts the mortar there and the next stones will be problematic. He does, however, if you're putting a stone on the top layer, where no further stones will be added above it, that act of putting the stone there would already be considered building and is a prohibition. He does, however, if you place a stone on top of just utensils, not other stones that have already been stacked and stuck together, you wouldn't be liable for the process of building. Again, obviously, wherever we say patur, you're not liable, but still it's an act that is not permitted according to rabbinic law. The halacha 13, if somebody erects a permanent tent, this is a derivative of building, and one would be liable for that. Similarly, similarly, if you're fashioning an earthenware vessel, an oven or a jug, before it gets fired up, because firing it up would be a problem of cooking on Shabbos, but the very act of molding it, of shaping it, of putting it together, that's already a derivative of building. Similarly, one who makes cheese, this is interesting. We touched on it already. Cheese is you binding things together to build something new. That is also a derivative of building. But one over here, the amount that you need to do, before we said building, even the smallest act, the smallest amount is already a prohibition and transgression. When it comes to making cheese, which is binding different things together, he says there the amount has to be like other food-related prohibitions. You have to create at least the size of a dried out fig, the gregaris, which is the halachic size that we've referred to previously. And a person, here he speaks about somebody, if you insert a blade of an axe into its handle, right? So now you've got a functioning axe, or one who performs any similar activity. This is all a derivative of building. Similarly, one who attaches one piece of wood to another, whether he attaches it with a nail or by putting another piece of wood through them so that they become one entity, this is all a derivative of building on Shabbos and is prohibited. Ha'isa nekev. This is an interesting situation where you're kind of creating something. Yeah, he says you make a small little hole in a chicken coop. And the idea of this, I think, to allow a little bit of light in. Yes, he goes and says, he says this is because it's the small, even though it's the smallest amount of littlest hole, you're doing something constructive for this structure to bring in light. That's already considered building. And similarly, if you replace a door of a well or a cistern or to one wing of a house, as soon as you put that door in, this is considered building. It adds, it creates, it constructs, and is building. What's the parallel malacha, or the opposite, if you want to call it malacha of building, is asayser, destroying, demolishing. And again, if you demolish even the smallest amount on Shabbos, you're chayiv. But again, here we see that this has got to be with some type of constructive intent. If you're demolishing in order to rebuild. But if you just simply destroy something, that is your potter. Obviously, you can't do it, but you're not liable. Again, unless he does it in anger and he relieves himself, right? In some way, then it becomes something positive and constructive, as we said previously. Someone who takes down a permanent tent or separates pieces of wood that we spoke about that have been touched in a particular way earlier. This is also forbidden because mine, and as long as again his intention over here was some type of constructive intention. Halacha 16. Hamakim patish. So this is now its own type of malacha. This malacha is called giving the final hammer's blow. So putting the last nail into something with the hammer, that is the biblical prohibition. Now, of course, there'll be some type of overlap here between building and doing the final act. You know, sometimes the final act is also considered building. Sometimes you will have built before you did the final act, and so on. So he gives examples. He says anything that completes the task. Harizeh told us makabapatish is a derivative of this malacha of putting in the final hammer's blow, and one would be liable. What's an example? For example, glass blower who blows the last air into the glass, or somebody who etches out a design on a vessel, even if it's just a portion of the design, it's the last touches on a design, or one who smooths out a utensil, or if you make a hole, even a smaller size, into wood or a building or into a piece of metal or a utensil, all of these, it's the final act. It's an act that turns something from something that wasn't yet useful or wasn't yet complete into something that's now useful or something that is complete. And this is, although it's not an act of banging something in with a hammer, but it completes the job, it makes it useful. That is a derivative of the final hammer's blow, this particular malacha. He just makes a point here. He says, you're not liable for making a hole unless it can be used to bring in and out. In other words, it has to be useful. It has to be something that actually transforms whatever you're making the hole into something useful. An interesting example from the Rambam. He says, if somebody pierces a blister on Shabbos, and the idea over here is that you're making a hole in order that it opens it up so it's exposed to air, so that it begins the process of healing. He says that is a professional act that a doctor would do. This he says is an act of makabapatish, of dealing the final hammer's blow, if it was done by a doctor, right? And therefore, this is something that is prohibited. Someone cannot do that. Pierce a blister in order to enable the healing. He says, however, he says, but if you pierce it simply to remove the pus, let's say you're experiencing some pain, and your intention is just to relieve the pressure and the pain, then that's not a problem. If the intention is, and it's done in order to be the act of healing per se, that is a problem, and that is a makabapatish. One cannot do that on Shabbos. Hamasates. This is the next malacha that the Rambam deals with, which is when you file something down. So you're filing down a stone because you need to fit it somewhere, I guess. So even filing the slightest amount is already a prohibition, and one would be chayav of. Sorry, this is a part of also makabapatish, right? Filing it down because it makes it now fitting for what your purpose is. Or similarly, aligning a stone into the foundation of building, or adjusting the position with your hands to put it in its right place, right? All of these is a derivative of the makabapatish, of dealing the final hammer's blow. If you remove threads or straw or splinters of wood from a garment by hand, for example, the splinters that are found in woolen garments, one is liable for performing the derivative dealing of the final hammer blow, but he says it's only if somebody's disturbed by it, like you feel uncomfortable wearing it as it is, and for you, it's only going to be considered wearable once you take those things off. then you're liable, because now you're taking a garment that was not complete and you're completing it. But if you kind of just as a habit, you pull off those little woolly pieces or whatever it might be, that's not transgressing this, or at least you wouldn't be liable for the makav patish. Obviously, it's something one would avoid on Shabbos. And another example is if somebody shakes out a new garment, if it's a black garment and there's little pieces of wool, white wool, or whatever it is, and you shake it out, he says, as the tailors would do, because now it makes it the garment that you want. That is a problem, makav patish. But if you're not disturbed by it, if you're not worried about those little threads of white on the garment, then for you it would be permissible, no problem. Now onto the final malacha that we deal with today. This is the 28th malacha in the count in the Rambam's count. This is the malacha of trapping animals. So the Rambam says the malacha is done when we talk about those type of species that are commonly trapped. So wild animals, birds, or fish. And the act of trapping must be that you put it into, you move it into a place where you don't require any further effort in order to actually get a hold of it. So for example, he says, if you chase a deer into a small garden, into a home, and you shut the door behind it, or you kind of scare a bird into a cabinet and then you close the cabinet, or that you lift a pail, a bucket of water, a bucket into the river or to the sea, and you lift it up and there's a fish inside it, because it's now in a very contained area. You don't have to do anything further to get a hold of this animal, this bird, or this fish. He says, however, if you pushed a bird, so to speak, into the home, so it still flies around the house, even though you close the door, but it's not in a very contained, covered area, you're still going to have to chase after it. Or if you put a fish into a big pool of water, or if you chase a deer into a big open field. So even though you shut the door behind it, that's not considered absolute trapping, because you still have to go through effort to grab a hold of it and to get onto it. And therefore, that would not be, you wouldn't be liable for those things. And he gives a definition. So what's considered a big place, or what's considered a small contained space or a big space? So he says, we're talking about if it's now in an area with one move you can grab onto it, or where the shadow of the sun closes the entire area off, that's considered a small enough area. If anything bigger, that would be considered an area that is larger and not considered contained just because you've shut the door on it. Why? Because you still have to make an effort to actually get a hold of the animal, and therefore you would not have been liable. Of course, again, something you don't do, rabbinically prohibited, but you're not liable for the biblical transgression and punishment in that instance. Now, here we've spoken about the 8 different type of creeping rodents that the Torah mentioned, and other creeping crawling things. So he says some of them you would trap, and a person who does trap those things, whether you for intention or not for intention, you're simply doing it for the fun, one would be liable, because your intention is to trap and you actually did it, even though it's not something that you're going to have personal benefit from, right? So a person would be liable for doing that labor, even though he doesn't need the results of it. He says somebody who traps an animal that is sleeping or blind is also liable. We'll see the final halacha will tell us that an animal that is sick or very old, you wouldn't be liable for, because there it's basically considered trapped. Your effort doesn't really entrap it as much as the state of the animal makes it easily accessible. Okay, but before we get to that one, which we'll look at inside, we've got 2 or 3 more details here. He says, this is a very interesting halacha. He says, if you've got hunting dogs, basically, and you send the dogs to chase after rabbits here, and that enables you to catch it, that is a problem. That is a problem on Shabbos, and is a derivative of the law, the mitzvah of trapping, or the malacha of trapping. One cannot do this on Shabbos. Now, we learned previously that certain malachot, if it's an act that one person can do and 2 people do it, you're not going to do it, but you putter, right? So we're going to apply that theme here to the laws of trapping. So let's say a deer is stuck in a room, and what happens? 2 people come along, or let's say one person comes along and closes the door, he is liable for trapping. If 2 people close that door that one person could have closed, both of them are not liable, even though it's something that you're not allowed to do. However, if it's something that one could not do on his own, and they both, if it was something that one couldn't do on their own right, but needed two people, then of course they would both be liable for this. Now here's an interesting scenario. A deer goes into a room and the door is open. You don't lock the door, but one person sits at the entrance. The idea is that if one person's sitting at the entrance, well, so two scenarios. If the guy actually takes up the whole entrance and the deer's not going to be able to go out, and if somebody else comes and sits next to him, the second person hasn't done anything. But if the first person sits in, there's still room for the deer to go out, and the second person comes along and sits next to him, the second person now is basically essentially the one that has trapped the animal, and he's the one that becomes liable. The Rambam says over here, it's even further, that if I sit in front of a doorway and I fill the doorway so that the animal cannot get out, and then somebody comes and sits behind me, and then I get up and walk away, even though I got up and walked away, and now it's the second person that's still sitting there waiting till after Shabbos, only the first person is liable, not the second person, because when the second person sat down, he didn't actually do an act of trapping the animal because it was already trapped and stuck where it was to be. Just a similar example of where you didn't do anything, but it kind of somebody got trapped, and you're not liable. You can leave it there. He says if a fowl enters under a person's garment or clothing, you don't have to let it out. You can sit still and you can wait till after Shabbos, and then you can take it. As you mentioned before, halacha 24, the Rambam says that if a person traps a deer that's very old, limping, or sick, or it's too small to move around, you're not liable. And the idea there is because it's basically easy prey. You didn't have to trap it in order to get a hold of it. Its state was already kind of as if it's in trap. A person who releases animals, right? This is interesting because many of the halachas we learned today was like if you tied a knot, untied a knot, sewed or tore, stuck or unstuck, right? The unsticking, the unsewing, or the tearing, or the untying is a malacha. But over here, freeing an animal, beast, or whatever it is from a trap is not a malacha. One would be potter for this. And now, similarly, if you trap, right at the beginning, the Rambam says that trapping is dafka, those type of animals that usually we trap. But if somebody traps something that's not usually trapped, he gives examples of locusts, or wild bees, hornets, mosquitoes, fleas, and the like, one is not liable. Again, it's not something we do, but it's not the biblical prohibition. And the final halacha in this chapter, halacha 25, crawling beasts that are dangerous. He gives examples like snakes, scorpions, the like may be trapped on Shabbos, even if they're not deadly, right? But merely they're going to bite you. Provided that my intention is to protect me from being bitten and not the intention to trap the animal. What should you do? You can place a bucket over it or cover it with something, just so that they cannot cause the damage that you're trying to avoid. Your intention, again, is not about trapping them to keep them. Your intention is about containing them, that they don't do any type of damage that you may be afraid of. Okay, so that's quite a lot covered. I hope that was clear. And we end